They were married but living like strangers, until one night she walked into his office and reminded them both what it felt like to be truly alive. The clock on the computer screen showed 11:47 p.m., but he didn't notice. His eyes were focused on the blueprints spread across his desk, red pen in hand as he made corrections to the building design. The small desk lamp created a warm circle of light in the otherwise dark room, making everything beyond his workspace fade into shadows. This had become his routine over the past few months. Come home from the office, have dinner, then retreat to his home office to catch up on projects that seemed to multiply faster than he could complete them. The architectural firm was growing, which was good news, but it meant longer hours and more pressure to deliver perfect designs. He rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. The house was completely quiet around him. Earlier that evening, his wife had mentioned she was going out with her sister for some shopping. Something about wanting to try new styles and break out of her usual routine. She had seemed excited about it, more animated than he'd seen her in weeks. When was the last time they'd really talked? Not about bills or schedules or work stress, but actually talked about their dreams, their hopes, the things that made them laugh? He couldn't remember, and that realization hit him harder than he expected. Their marriage wasn't bad. It was comfortable, stable, predictable. They both had their routines, their separate interests, their own ways of handling the day-to-day responsibilities of adult life. But somewhere along the way, they'd stopped surprising each other. They'd stopped being curious about who the other person was becoming. He remembered their early days together in college. She used to drag him on spontaneous adventures, midnight drives to watch sunrise from a hill outside town, trying new restaurants in neighborhoods they'd never explored, dancing in their tiny apartment kitchen while cooking dinner. She had this incredible laugh that would start as a giggle and build into something so genuine and infectious that everyone around her couldn't help but smile. When had that stopped? When had they both become so serious, so focused on checking boxes and meeting expectations that they forgot to enjoy each other's company? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his thoughts. He glanced at the clock again, almost midnight. They must have had quite an adventure. He could hear the car doors closing, followed by the sisters talking and laughing as they walked to the front door. Their voices carried the kind of energy that comes from a really good evening out. He turned back to his work, expecting to hear the familiar routine, shoes being kicked off in the entryway, keys dropped in the bowl. By the door, the quiet sounds of someone getting ready for bed. Instead, he heard something different. There was music playing softly downstairs, and the conversation between the sisters continued for several more minutes. What were they doing down there? Usually, his wife would come upstairs fairly quickly, maybe stop by his office to say goodnight, before heading to bed. But tonight felt different. There was an energy in the house that hadn't been there in months. He tried to focus back on the blueprints, but found his mind wandering. The building he was designing was supposed to be innovative, something that would stand out in the city skyline. But looking at his current design, he realized it was safe, conventional, exactly like dozens of other buildings. When had he stopped taking creative risks in his work? When had good enough become his standard instead of extraordinary? The voices downstairs grew quieter, and he heard the front door close as his sister-in-law left. Now the house fell into its familiar evening. Quiet, but something felt different. There was an anticipation in the air, like the moment before a storm when everything becomes very still. He set down his red pen and really looked at the work scattered across his desk. Projects that had deadlines, revisions that needed to be made, emails that required responses. All important, all necessary, but none of it felt alive or exciting. None of it reflected the passion that had led him to become an architect in the first place. Maybe his wife was right to shake up her routine. Tonight, maybe they both needed to remember what it felt like to try something new, to step outside the comfortable patterns they'd created. He thought about the last time he'd surprised her with something spontaneous, something that had nothing to do with their practical, responsible adult lives. The footsteps on the stairs were lighter than usual, almost bouncing. He could hear her, coming up, but something about her movement seemed different, more energetic, more purposeful. Usually she tried to be quiet when he was working late, careful not to disturb his concentration. But tonight, those footsteps were heady. The office door didn't just open. It practically burst open like someone had been holding back excitement and finally couldn't contain it anymore. He looked up from his blueprints, expecting to see his wife's usual tired but content expression after a night out with her sister. Instead, he saw something completely unexpected. She was laughing. Not the polite, quiet laugh she usually gave when sharing a mildly funny story from her day, but a real, genuine laugh that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside her chest. Her whole face was lit up with joy, her eyes sparkling in a way he hadn't seen in months, maybe years. For a moment he just stared. When was the last time he'd seen her laugh like that? The sound was so familiar, yet so surprising that it took him a few seconds to process what he was seeing. This was the laugh he'd fallen in love with back in college, the one that used to make him stop whatever he was doing just to watch her face light up. "You will not believe what just happened tonight," she said, still giggling as she stepped into the room. Her voice had an energy to it that made him immediately push back from his desk. Something was different about her entire presence. She seemed taller somehow, more confident, like she was taking up space in a way she hadn't in a long time. His first thought was concern. Had something gone wrong? Was she okay? But looking at her face, seeing the genuine happiness radiating from her expression, he realized this wasn't distress or shock. This was pure, unfiltered joy. "What happened? Are you all right?" he asked, turning his chair to face her completely. The blueprints on his desk suddenly seemed completely unimportant compared to whatever had transformed his wife into this glowing, energetic person standing in his doorway. She stepped further into the room, and he noticed she was moving differently, too. Usually after a night out she would move carefully, quietly, trying not to disturb his work routine. But tonight, she walked with purpose, with confidence, like she owned the space around her. "I'm more than all right," she said, and started to remove the cardigan she'd been wearing when she left the house earlier. "I feel like I just remembered who I used to be." As she pulled off the safe, conservative sweater, he could see she was wearing something completely different underneath. The boring blouse he'd seen her put on that afternoon was gone, replaced by something that made his breath catch in his throat. But it wasn't just the clothes that caught his attention. It was the way she moved, the way she held herself, the way she seemed to glow with newfound confidence. This was like watching someone step out of a shell they'd been hiding in for years. "Your sister really talked you into trying something new, didn't she?" he said, unable to keep the amazement out of his voice. "She didn't talk me into anything," his wife replied, still smiling that incredible smile. "She just reminded me that I used to be brave, that I used to try new things and not worry so much about what other people might think." He watched as she continued to reveal her new look, piece by piece, and realized he was witnessing something much more significant than a simple wardrobe change. This was someone reclaiming a part of themselves they'd lost along the way. "You should have seen me in the dressing room," she continued, her excitement infectious. "At first I kept saying I can't wear this or this isn't me. But then your sister asked when I decided that being safe and invisible was better than being myself." The question hung in the air between them, and he realized it applied to him too. When had they both decided that blending in was better than standing out? When had they chosen comfort over excitement, routine over adventure? "And what did you tell her?" he asked, genuinely curious about this conversation that seemed to have sparked such a dramatic change in his wife. "I couldn't answer her," she said, laughing again, "because I couldn't remember when I'd made that choice. It just happened gradually, one safe decision at a time, until I forgot I used to be someone who took risks and tried new things." She moved closer to his desk, and he could see the transformation wasn't just about clothes or confidence. There was something in her eyes that reminded him of the woman who used to surprise him with spontaneous weekend trips, who would drag him to art shows and concerts for bands they'd never heard of, who would suggest they rearrange all the furniture in their apartment just because she was bored with the old layout. "So tonight I decided to remember," she said simply. "I tried on clothes I would never normally consider. I walked differently. I talked to strangers. I laughed louder than I have in years. And you know what? It felt amazing. He found himself, smiling, caught up in her enthusiasm despite himself. "You look amazing," he said, and meant it completely, not just because of the new clothes, but because of the light in her eyes, the energy radiating from her entire being. "I feel like myself again," she said. "Like the person I was before I got so worried about being practical and responsible and safe all the time." Looking at her now, glowing with rediscovered confidence, he realized how much he'd missed this version of his wife without even knowing it was gone. What she revealed wasn't just a new outfit. It was like watching someone become themselves again after years of hiding. The dress she wore was beautiful, flowing in ways that emphasized her natural grace, while the colors brought out the warmth in her eyes. But more than the clothes themselves, it was how she wore them that took his breath away. She stood differently now, shoulders back, chin up, owning her space in a way that reminded him of their early days together. Back then, she would walk into a room and somehow make everything more interesting just by being there. Somehow, over the years, that magnetic confidence had faded into something more cautious, more reserved. "Turn around," he said softly, still, amazed by the transformation. "Let me see the whole thing." She spun slowly, and he could see she was enjoying his reaction. There was playfulness in her movement, a joy in being seen and appreciated that had been missing from their interactions for too long. When was the last time they'd looked at each other with this kind of wonder? "Your sister has good taste," he said, but she shook her head. This wasn't her choice. She just kept pushing clothes into my hands and saying, "Try it." But when I put this on and looked in the mirror, she paused, searching for the right words. "I saw someone I recognized but hadn't seen in years." She moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street below, and he could see her profile in the soft light from his desk lamp. There was something different about her posture, her expression, even the way she breathed. It was like she'd been holding herself carefully for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to relax into her own skin. "You know what's funny?" she continued, turning back to face him. "I kept apologizing to the saleswoman for trying on so many different things, like I was taking up too much space, asking for too much attention. And your sister finally said, 'Stop apologizing for existing.'" The words hit him unexpectedly hard. When had his wife started apologizing for existing? When had she become so careful about taking up space, asking for attention, expressing her own preferences and desires? "That's what I've been doing, isn't it?" she said, reading his expression. "Apologizing for existing, making myself smaller and quieter and more convenient until I almost disappeared entirely." He stood up from his chair, moved by an impulse to close the distance between them. "You never disappeared," he said. "You were always there." "Was I, though?" she asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. "Or was I just going through the motions, getting up, going to work, coming home, cooking dinner, watching television, going to bed, same routine day after day until I forgot there were other ways to live?" She was right, and they both knew it. Their life had become a series of habits, comfortable and predictable, but lacking the spark that had once made every day feel like an adventure. They'd become roommates managing a household rather than partners exploring life together. "The woman in the store asked me what I was celebrating," she continued, smoothing the fabric of her new dress. "And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I dressed up for anything other than a work event or a wedding. When did we stop celebrating regular days? When did looking good become something we only did for special occasions?" He thought about his own closet, filled with practical clothes for practical purposes. When had he stopped caring about looking good for her? When had he decided that comfort was more important than making an effort? "So, what did you tell her?" "The woman in the store?" he asked. His wife smiled, that radiant smile that had been lighting up the room since she'd walked in. "I told her I was celebrating remembering who I am." She moved closer to him now, and he could smell her perfume, the same scent she'd worn for years, but somehow it seemed different on this confident, glowing version of herself. Everything about her seemed heightened, more vivid, more alive. "I bought 3 new outfits tonight," she said with a hint of rebellion in her voice. 3. I can't remember the last time I bought something just because I loved how it looked on me, not because I needed it for work or because it was practical. Good, he said, surprising himself with how firmly he meant it. You should buy things that make you feel good. I should do a lot of things that make me feel good, she replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was talking about more than just shopping. Looking at her now, he realized he'd been sleepwalking through his own life, too. When had he stopped noticing how beautiful his wife was? When had he stopped making an effort to surprise her, to court her, to make her feel desired and appreciated? You know what else I realized tonight? She said, moving even closer. I realized that I've been waiting for permission to be myself. Permission to take up space, to want things, to try new experiences. But no one can give me that permission except me. The transformation was complete now, and he could see it wasn't just about the clothes or even the confidence. It was about someone deciding to stop hiding, to stop making themselves small, to stop apologizing for having desires and dreams and the audacity to pursue them. So what happens now? He asked, genuinely curious about what this new version of his wife might do next. Without any hesitation, she crossed the room and reached for his hands, gently pulling him up from his chair. Her touch was warm and confident, so different from the careful, almost apologetic way she'd been approaching him in recent months. When had they stopped being spontaneous with each other? When had every interaction become so predictable and polite? Come here, she said softly, drawing him closer until they were standing face to face in the soft light of his desk lamp. I want to tell you something important. He let himself be pulled into her space, suddenly aware of how long it had been since they'd stood this close without it being a brief hug goodbye in the morning or a quick kiss goodnight. Really close, where he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes and notice the way her smile reached all the way to her temples. What is it? He asked, genuinely curious about what had sparked this dramatic change in her. Tonight, while I was trying on all these new clothes, I kept thinking about us, she began, her hand still holding his. About how we used to be. Do you remember our second date? You took me to that little jazz club downtown. He smiled, the memory coming back clearly. You wore that blue dress and spent the whole evening talking to the saxophone player during his breaks. And you weren't jealous at all. You thought it was fascinating that I was so curious about everything. You said you loved watching me discover new things. Her eyes grew brighter as she spoke. When did we stop being curious about each other? The question hung between them, heavy with years of comfortable routine and assumptions. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd asked her about her dreams, her fears, her random thoughts about the world. Somewhere along the way, they'd stopped exploring each other's minds. I don't know, he admitted honestly. I think we got busy with life and forgot that getting to know each other was supposed to be an ongoing thing, not something we finished once we got married. She nodded, moving even closer. Tonight I remembered what it felt like to surprise myself. And I realized I wanted to surprise you too. Not with some grand gesture, but just by being myself again. The real me. Not the careful, quiet version I've been for too long. Standing there in the intimate circle of lamplight, surrounded by the scattered papers of his work life, he felt something shift between them. It was like a wall he hadn't even noticed building over the years was suddenly dissolving. You know, what I realized tonight, he said, looking down at their joined hands. I've been hiding too, not behind clothes, but behind work, behind routine, behind being responsible and practical. I used to write you songs on my guitar. I used to plan surprise picnics. When did I stop doing things just to see you smile? When did we both decide that being adults meant being boring? She asked, laughing softly. I don't know, but I don't want to be boring anymore, he said, surprised by how strongly he meant it. I want to remember what it feels like to be excited about life again. About us again. They stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other, really seeing each other maybe for the first time in months. He noticed things he'd forgotten to pay attention to, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the tiny scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off her bike as a kid, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. So what do we do now? He asked. How do we get back to being the people who used to stay up all night talking about everything and nothing? We start talking, she said simply. Really talking. About more than just schedules and bills and whose turn it is to take out the trash. He pulled her closer, struck by how natural it felt despite how long it had been since they'd been spontaneously intimate like this. Not intimate in a physical sense, but emotionally present with each other. I miss you, he said quietly. I miss us. I miss us too, she replied. But we're still here. We just got lost for a while under all the responsibility and routine. They began talking then, really talking, in a way they hadn't in years. She told him about her dreams that she'd put on hold, about feeling invisible at work, about missing the version of herself who used to paint and write poetry. He shared his frustrations with playing it safe in his designs, his fear that he'd become just another architect creating forgettable buildings. As they talked, he found himself remembering why he'd fallen in love with her mind as much as anything else. She was thoughtful, funny, full of ideas and observations that made him see the world differently. When had he stopped asking for her opinions on things that mattered to him? We should plan a trip, she said suddenly. Somewhere we've never been, somewhere that will force us to be adventurous again. Yes, he agreed immediately. Somewhere completely different from here. They spent the next hour planning an imaginary vacation, laughing about ridiculous scenarios and debating the merits of different destinations. It felt like being young again, when the future was full of possibilities instead of obligations. When she finally pulled him down onto the small couch in his office, it wasn't just about physical closeness. It was about choosing to prioritize each other over the endless list of tasks and responsibilities that usually demanded their attention. For the first time in months, he completely forgot about the work scattered across his desk. 3 weeks after that night, their entire life felt different. Not dramatically, earth-shatteringly different, but different in all the small ways that actually matter in a marriage. She had started wearing colors again, bright blues and deep greens that made her skin glow. He had begun leaving work at the office instead of bringing it home every night. The changes weren't just about them individually, but about how they moved through the world together. Last Saturday, instead of their usual routine of grocery shopping and household chores, they had driven to the coast just to watch the sunset. No agenda, no plan. Just two people deciding that beauty was more important than productivity for one evening. Do you remember what we used to call these? She asked him as they sat on a blanket they'd grabbed from the car, watching the sky turn pink and orange over the water. Our random adventures, he said, smiling at the memory. We used to do this all the time. Every weekend was a new discovery, a new restaurant, a new hiking trail, a new bookstore in a neighborhood we'd never explored. She leaned against his shoulder. When did we convince ourselves that being responsible meant giving up curiosity? It was a good question, one they'd been asking themselves a lot lately. The answer seemed to be that it had happened gradually, one small compromise at a time, until adventure became something they might do someday instead of something they chose to do regularly. Their friends had started noticing the change too. At dinner parties, instead of sitting quietly while others dominated the conversation, she was sharing stories and asking questions that got everyone talking. He was suggesting activities beyond their usual safe choices, like the pottery class they'd signed up for together or the salsa dancing lessons that terrified and excited them both. You two seem really happy lately, their neighbor had commented just yesterday. What's your secret? The secret, they'd realized, wasn't complicated. It was simply deciding to stay interested in each other and in life. It was choosing growth over comfort, curiosity over routine, connection over convenience. At work, she had finally spoken up in that important meeting, sharing ideas she'd been keeping to herself for months. Her supervisor had been impressed enough to ask her to lead a new project. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, he'd said, but keep it up. He had started taking creative risks in his architectural designs again, proposing innovative solutions instead of playing it safe. His latest building concept, a mixed-use space that incorporated community gardens and artist studios, had been approved for development. It was the kind of project he'd dreamed about in school but had stopped believing was possible in the real world. I have an idea, she said one evening as they sat in their kitchen, lingering over dinner instead of rushing off to separate activities. What if we redecorated the living room? Not because we need to, but just because it might be fun to try something completely different. 6 months ago, such a suggestion would have been met with concerns about budget and practicality. Now, he found himself excited by the possibility. What did you have in mind? I don't know yet. That's what would make it an adventure. They spent the evening looking through design magazines and websites, not with the goal of copying someone else's style, but with the curiosity to discover what they actually liked when they weren't trying to make safe, conventional choices. The physical changes in their home began to reflect the emotional changes in their relationship. They replaced their beige sofa with something bold and colorful. They hung art that made them feel something instead of art that simply matched the walls. They created spaces that invited conversation and creativity instead of spaces that simply looked acceptable. But the most significant change was how they talked to each other. Instead of the functional conversations about schedules and responsibilities, they were having the kind of talks that lasted hours and left them feeling more connected than when they'd started. What's something you've always wanted to try but never thought you could? Became a regular dinner conversation starter. The answers surprised them both and led to everything from cooking classes to hiking trips to learning new languages together. They started a tradition of monthly discovery dates where they would try something neither of them had ever done before: rock climbing, wine tasting, visiting museums they'd never heard of, taking cooking classes for cuisines from countries they hoped to visit someday. Remember when we thought being married meant settling down? She said one evening as they walked home from a poetry reading at a local bookstore. Now I think it means settling in, he replied. Like settling into who we really are instead of who we think we're supposed to be. Their relationship became a source of energy instead of something that required careful management. Instead of walking on eggshells around each other's moods and sensitivities, they were encouraging each other to take risks, try new things, express opinions they might have kept to themselves before. The night she had entered his office laughing had become a story they told, not as a single moment of transformation, but as the beginning of an ongoing decision to keep choosing each other and choosing growth over comfort. The best part, she told her sister a few months later, is that we're not trying to go back to who we used to be. We're discovering who we are now together. Looking back, they realized that the shopping trip hadn't just given her new clothes. It had reminded them both that people are supposed to keep growing, keep changing, keep surprising each other. The alternative, staying the same out of fear or habit, wasn't actually safer. It was just slower, quieter way of disappearing. Now, every day held the possibility of discovery, and every evening was an opportunity to really see each other.